The Civil War began while the United States was under the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson, who was officially neutral in regard to the Civil War, with the U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk stated that America is not in a position to take action, as Nigeria is an area under British influence. Strategically, U.S. interests aligned with the federal military government, although there was considerable popular public sentiment in support of Biafra. The U.S. also saw value in its alliance with Lagos and sought to protect $800 million in the assessment of the State Department worth of private investment. The neutrality was not universally popular, and a pro-Biafra lobby emerged within the United States to pressure the U.S. government to take a more active role in assisting Biafra. The American Committee to Keep Biafra Alive was an organization founded by American activists to inform the American public of the war and sway popular opinion towards Biafra. Biafra became a topic in the 1968 United States presidential election, and on the 9th of September 1968, future Republican President Richard Nixon called for Lyndon B. Johnson to take action in helping Biafra, stating, "Until now, efforts to relieve the Biafran people have been thwarted by the desire of central government of Nigeria to pursue total and unconditional victory, and by the fear of the Igbo people that surrender means wholesale atrocities and genocide." But genocide is what is taking place right now, and starvation is the grim reaper. Both Biafran officials and the U.S. pro-Biafra lobby hoped the election of Richard Nixon would change U.S. foreign policy regarding the war. However, when Nixon became president in 1969, he found there was little he could do to change the established stance aside from calling for another round of peace talks. According to American political theorist Ernest W. Lefevre, the U.S. providing official support to Biafra would have resulted in hostility from not only Nigeria, but also other African nations who supported Nigeria in the war, who had successfully argued to the United Nations that the war was an internal affair that the UN should not be involved with. The Vietnam War served as another obstacle to a possible U.S. intervention in Biafra. Despite this, Nixon continued to personally support Biafra. Himself a Jew who escaped persecution from Nazi Germany, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger compared the Igbo people to Jews in a memorial written to the U.S. President Richard Nixon, stating, "The Igbos are the wandering Jews of West Africa, gifted, aggressive, westernized, at best envied and resented, but mostly despised by the mass of their neighbors in the Federation." Gulf oil. Nigeria, the third major player in Nigerian oil, was producing 9% of the oil coming out of Nigeria before the war began. Its operations were all located offshore of the federally controlled Midwestern Territory. Therefore, it continued to pay royalties to the federal government, and its operations were mostly undisrupted.
Canada. At the request of the Nigerian government, Canada sent 3 observers to investigate allegations of genocide and war crimes against the Nigerian military. Major General W. A. Milroy was joined by 2 other Canadian officers in 1968, and the Canadian contingent remained until February 1970. Rest of Africa. Biafra appealed unsuccessfully for support from the Organization of African Unity, OAU, the precursor to the African Union. The OAU, bound by its charter to oppose any secession from a member state, denounced Biafra's attempt to secede from Nigeria. Equally bound by its charter to refrain from interference in the internal affairs of its member states, the OAU took no further action. Countries such as Ethiopia and Egypt vocally supported the Nigerian government's policies in order to prevent inspiring revolts within their own borders. However, Biafra received the support of African countries such as Tanzania, Zambia, Gabon, and Ivory Coast. Rhodesian pilots smuggled weapons and money into Biafra, which Rhodesian intelligence chief Ken Flower claimed was part of the operations of Rhodesia's Central Intelligence Organization. Foreign mercenaries. Outmatched by Nigeria's superior firepower, Biafra hired foreign mercenaries for extra support. Mercenaries with prior experience fighting in the Congo crisis were eagerly drawn to Biafra. German mercenary Rolf Steiner was placed in charge of the 4th Commando Brigade of the Biafran Armed Forces and commanded 3,000 men. Welsh mercenary Taffy Williams, one of Steiner's subordinates, was in command of 100 Biafran fighters. Steiner's other subordinates were a mixture of adventurers consisting of the Italian Giorgio Norbiato, the Rhodesian explosive expert Johnny Erasmus, the Scotsman Alexander Alec Gay, the Irishman Lewis Paddy Mulrooney, the Corsican Armand Ierinelli, who had been able to enlist in the Foreign Legion by pretending to be Italian, and a Jamaican bartender turned mercenary who called himself Johnny Korea. Polish-Swiss pilot Jan Zumbach formed and commanded a ragtag air force for Biafra. Canadian pilot Lynn Garrison, Swedish pilot Carl Gustav von Rosen, and Rhodesian pilot Jack Malik served as leaders of Biafran air operations, attacking Nigerian forces and also supplying weapons and food aid. Portuguese pilots also served in the Biafran Air Force, transporting weapons from Portugal to Biafra. Steiner established a brown water navy by converting some Chris-Craft boats into gunboats, which turned out to be successful in launching surprise raids for weapons and supplies.
It was hoped that employing mercenaries in Nigeria would have impact similar to that experienced in the Congo, but the mercenaries proved largely ineffective since the Nigerian military received much more professional and adequate training compared to the Congolese militias. Despite some initial successes, such as Operation OAU, over half of the 4th Commando Brigade was wiped out by Nigerian forces during the disastrous Operation Hiroshima of 15 to 29th of November 1968, resulting in Steiner experiencing depression and a nervous breakdown, leading to his eventual expulsion and replacement by Taffy Williams. Although Nigeria appeared to be a tougher opponent, commentators observing the war noted that the remaining mercenaries appeared to have developed a personal or ideological commitment to Biafra's cause, which is a rare trait for mercenaries. Belgian mercenary Mark Goossens, who was killed by defensive Nigerian forces in a suicide mission during Operation Hiroshima, was reportedly motivated to return to Africa after a dispute with his girlfriend. Goossens was photographed in the moments before and after his death. Steiner claimed to have fought for Biafra for idealistic reasons, saying the Igbo people were the victims of genocide. But the American journalist Ted Morgan mocked his claims, describing Steiner as a militarist who simply craved war because killing was the only thing he knew how to do well. Journalist Frederick Forsyth quotes Taffy Williams, speaking highly of his Biafran subordinates. "I've seen a lot of Africans at war, but there's nobody to touch these people. Give me 10,000 Biafrans for 6 months, and we'll build an army that would be invincible on this continent. I've seen men die in this war who would have won the Victoria Cross in another context." After the war, Philip Effiong, the chief of the Biafran General Staff, was asked by a journalist about the impact of the mercenaries on the war. His reply was, "They had not helped. It would have made no difference if not a single one of them came to work for the secessionist forces. Rolf Steiner stayed the longest. He was more of a bad influence than anything else. We were happy to get rid of him." Biafra surrounded. A makeshift airport in Calabar, Nigeria, where relief efforts to aid famine victims were deployed by helicopter teams. From 1968 onward, the war fell into a form of stalemate, with Nigerian forces unable to make significant advances into the remaining areas under Biafran control due to stiff resistance and major defeats in Abagana, Arochukwu, Oguta, Umuahia, Operation OAU, On, Ikot Ekpeni, etc. But another Nigerian offensive from April to June 1968 began to close the ring around the Biafrans, with further advances on the 2 northern fronts and the capture of Port Harcourt on the 19th of May 1968. The blockade of the surrounding Biafrans led to a humanitarian disaster when it emerged that there was widespread civilian hunger and starvation in the besieged Igbo areas. The Biafran government reported that Nigeria was using hunger and genocide to win the war and sought aid from the outside world. Private groups in the US, led by Senator Ted Kennedy, responded, "No one was ever held responsible for these killings." In September 1968, the Federal Army planned what Gowan described as the final offensive. Initially, the final offensive was neutralized by Biafran troops by the end of the year, after several Nigerian troops were routed in Biafran ambushes. In the latter stages, a southern federal military government offensive managed to break through. However, in 1969, the Biafrans launched several offensives against the Nigerians in their attempts to keep the Nigerians off balance starting in March, when the 14th Division of the Biafran Army recaptured Owerri and moved towards Port Harcourt, but were halted just north of the city. In May 1969, Biafran commandos recaptured oil wells in Kwal. In July 1969, Biafran forces launched a major land offensive supported by foreign mercenary pilots, continuing to fly in food, medical supplies, and weapons. Most notable of the mercenaries was Swedish Count Carl Gustav von Rosen, who led air attacks with 5 Malmö MFI-9 mini-coin small piston-engined aircraft. Armed with rocket pods and machine guns, his Biafran Air Force consisted of 3 Swedes, von Rosen, Gunnar Haglund, and Martin Lang. The other 2 pilots were Biafrans, Willie Murray Bruce and Augustus Opk. From the 22nd of May to the 8th of July 1969, von Rosen's small force attacked Nigerian military airfields in Port Harcourt, Enugu, Benin City, and Ughelli, destroying or damaging a number of Nigerian Air Force jets used to attack relief flights, including a few MiG-17s and 3 of Nigeria's 6 Ilyushin Il-28 bombers that were used to bomb Biafran villages and farms on a daily basis. Although the Biafran offensives of 1969 were a tactical success, the Nigerians soon recovered. The Biafran air attacks did disrupt the combat operations of the Nigerian Air Force, but only for a few months. In response to the Nigerian government using foreigners to lead some advances, the Biafran government also began hiring foreign mercenaries to extend the war. Only German-born Rolf Steiner, a lieutenant colonel with the 4th Commandos, and Major Taffy Williams, a Welshman, would remain for the duration. Nigeria deployed foreign aircraft in the form of Soviet MiG-17 and Il-28 bombers. Humanitarian crisis. Further information: blockade of Biafra and Biafran airlift. The September massacres and subsequent Igbo withdrawal from northern Nigeria was the basis for the initial human rights petition to the UN to end genocide and provided a historical link to Biafran claims of genocide during the Nigerian Civil War. Awareness of a mounting crisis rose in 1968. Information spread especially through religious networks, beginning with alerts from missionaries. It did not escape the notice of worldwide Christian organizations that the Biafrans were Christian and the northern Nigerians controlling the federal government were Muslim. Among these Christian efforts were the organization Joint Church Aid and Caritas, the latter aligned with various international Catholic aid groups. The famine was a result of the blockade that the Nigerian government had imposed on the eastern region in the months leading up to secession. Frederick Forsyth, then a journalist in Nigeria and later a successful novelist, observed that the main problem was kwashiorkor, a protein deficiency. Prior to the Civil War, the main source of dietary protein was dried fish imported from Norway, which was supplemented by local hogs, chicken, and eggs. The blockade prevented imports, and local protein supplies were quickly depleted. The national diet was now almost 100% starch. Bernard Kouchner was one of a number of French doctors who volunteered with the French Red Cross to work in hospitals and feeding centers in besieged Biafra. The Red Cross required volunteers to sign an agreement, which was seen by some like Kouchner and his supporters, as being similar to a gag order that was designed to maintain the organization's neutrality, whatever the circumstances. Kouchner and the other French doctors signed this agreement. After entering the country, the volunteers, in addition to Biafran health workers and hospitals, were subjected to attacks by the Nigerian army and witnessed civilians being murdered and starved by the blockading forces. Kouchner also witnessed these events, particularly the huge number of starving children, and when he returned to France, he publicly criticized the Nigerian government and the Red Cross for their seemingly complicit behavior. With the help of other French doctors, Kouchner put Biafra in the media spotlight and called for an international response to the situation. These doctors, led by Kouchner, concluded that a new aid organization was needed that would ignore political, religious boundaries and prioritize the welfare of victims. They formed the Comité de lutte contre le génocide au Biafra, which in 1971 became Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. The crisis brought about a large increase in prominence and funding of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, media and public opinion. Media and public relations played a central role in the war due to their influence on morale at home and the dynamics of international involvement. Both sides relied heavily on external support. Biafra hired the New York public relations firm of Ruder and Finn to lobby American public opinion. However, it was not until Biafra hired the Geneva Public Relations Market Press in January 1968 that significant international sympathy was won. Mark Press was headed by an American public relations executive, William Bernhardt, who was paid 12,000 Swiss francs per month for his services and who expected a share of Biafra's oil revenues after the war. Mark Press's portrayal of the war as a struggle for freedom by the Catholic Igbos against the Muslim-dominated North won the support of Catholic opinion all over the world, especially in the United States. Besides portraying the war as a Christian-Muslim conflict, Mark Press accused the federal government of waging genocide against the Igbos, a campaign that was extremely effective as pictures of starving Igbos won the sympathy of the world. Student protesters in The Hague, the 20th of November 1969. Media campaigns focused on the plight of the Biafrans intensified internationally in the summer of 1968. By the Biafran leadership, and then around the world, the pogroms and famine were classified as genocide and compared to the Holocaust. Hypothetical Judaic origins of the Igbos were used to bolster comparisons with Jews in Germany. In the international press, Igbo refugee camps were compared to Nazi extermination camps. Humanitarian appeals differed somewhat from place to place. In the United Kingdom, humanitarian aid used familiar discourses of imperial responsibility. In Ireland, advertisements appealed to shared Catholicism and experiences of civil war. Both of these appeals channeled older cultural values into support for the new model of international NGOs. In Ireland, public opinion identified intensely with Biafra, as most of the Catholic priests working in Biafra were Irish who naturally sympathized with the Biafrans, who they saw as fellow Catholics struggling for independence. The Irish journalist John Hogan, who covered the war, noted, "The threat of famine, combined with an independence struggle, had an almost irresistible political and emotional impact on Irish public opinion, which became hugely supportive of the regular airlifts, via the offshore Portuguese island of São Tomé, of food and medical supplies to the beleaguered infant republic. The use of famine as a conscious tactic by the use of the federal government, who wanted to starve Biafra into submission, provoked parallels with the Great Famine of Ireland of the 1840s, while many Irish people saw a parallel with Igbo struggle for independence with their own independence struggle. The pro-Biafra British journalist Frederick Forsyth started covering the war in the summer of 1967 for the BBC. became angry at the pro-Nigeria stance of the British government and resigned in protest in September 1967. Returning as a freelance journalist in 1968, Forrest worked closely with the Irish Holy Ghost Fathers to collect information about the famine, and whose dispatches from Biafra had an immense impact on British public opinion. In Israel, the Holocaust comparison was promoted, as was the theme of threat from hostile Muslim neighbours. The Biafran War presented Westerners with the notion of starving African children. The Biafran famine was one of the first African disasters to receive widespread media coverage, enabled by the proliferation of television sets. The televised disaster and the rising NGOs mutually enhanced each other. NGOs maintained their own communications networks and played a significant role in shaping news coverage.